Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. The Liberators is a sweeping novel of two Korean families. It opens with an arranged marriage, and the new couples move to another continent. And we meet four generations of that family told from multiple perspectives, and with the complicated history of their home country as the backdrop. It is a debut novel from our guest tonight, E.J. Ko. E.J. Ko is the award-winning author of the memoir, The Magical Language of Others, and the poetry collection, A Lesser Love. She is also Dr. Ko, as she earned her MFA at Columbia University and her PhD at the University of Washington. She has received National Endowments for the Arts and McDowell Fellowships. She's joining us from Seattle, Washington, where she lives. Welcome back to the Korea Society, EJ. It is great to see you.
Hi, so good to see you, Jay and Anton. Thank you for having me.
And returning tonight is Anton Hur, the author of the upcoming novel Toward Eternity, and an award-winning translator of many Korean literature, including Cursed Bunny, which is the 2023 National Book Award finalist. Anton, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me again.
If you have your own questions for EJ, please send them via email, artsandculture@koreasociety.org. So EJ, why don't we start with you reading some of your writings?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jay, again, for having me and all the kindness and warmth you've shown me throughout the years and this beautiful relationship with the Korea Society, and also Anton, who I am a huge admirer of, whose work I've been talking about constantly for many, many years. So thank you. And I'm excited to read a poem first. It's called Father in His Old Age. There is a Korean belief that you are born the parent of the one you hurt most. Watching my father use chopsticks to split chicken katsu, he confesses that I may be the reincarnation of his own father. We finish our waters in silence and walk home chatting about who to blame for where we are. He says, the present is the revenge of the past. Revenge goes too far, I argue, and in our unhappiness, we both want to know we cannot pay enough. Pain becomes meaning. After this life, I fear I'll never meet him again. I'm going to read a little passage from my memoir here, and it's interesting because I really quickly, when I was 14, my parents were offered a job in South Korea where they moved and left me behind and moved me about 100 miles away from where we were. And I had sort of entered my teenage years into the really darker parts of my youth. And so by the time I somehow found myself in college, in the last year of college, I was a hip hop dancer. I was competing in Southern California, and I thought that was mostly going to be my life. And I was really terrible in school, had a difficult time with my teachers, but to graduate, I needed to fulfill one math requirement, and I wasn't very good at math. So my school counselor said, maybe you can take an introduction to poetry class and we'll get you to graduate. And, that class completely changed my life. I walked in and I went home and wrote 40 poems that week. And the teacher took those poems and gave them to the poetry director, who in this scene I'm meeting for the first time, is sort of taking me under her wing, taking me in, and who I keep in touch to this day. And so she's brought me into her room and told me that we're going to change my program. We're going to change my requirements. And I'm going to be a poet now. You can say whatever you want, Joy said, if you reckon with it. Joy asked me to be relentlessly forgiving and magnanimous toward all conditions of human life and equally toward those of my own. She encouraged me to look closely and said poetry would teach me how to pay attention and show me how to care. I must choose love over any other thing. Then the world would open up for me. Do you see now? She asked me. That's why a poem is more than just words. It's why poets have everything. I'm excited to read just from the beginning of The Liberators here, my debut novel, and it's from the perspective of Johann. By an early age, I could read and write in 6 languages. I found a tool, an ink brush, a twig, or my stub finger, and used it to draw a character on parchment, dirt, or air. When one line touched another, my heart reached my fingertips to impart meaning. At 5, it was for pleasure that I left words all over town. On a tree, I carved tree. In the river, I spelled river in pebbles. On my mother's dress, I inked dress. At some point, my mother set me down and didn't pick me up again. On my mother's grave, I wrote grave. I was just a boy at the end of Japanese colonial rule. I wrote my words as if I couldn't live without them, as if I were made of nothing but words. I classed rock, plant, animal, man, and God. I observed a patch of weeds and then myself in the mirror to see the differences between plant and man. Between them was a middle point, or animal. I asked what stood between man and God, but the grave said nothing. I watched the country divided up as spoils of war. When I was 15, I was taken in for vandalism and sent to the military. I labeled my boots, boots, and my gun, gun. I spelled fire with sticks, lit it up in flames. Pen grenade, pulled the ring. My last words I wrote on the side of an ICU tent, filled with my dismembered comrades in the blood I owed them. Death, death, death. After my years in the military, I was made of silence. I carried out my duties quickly and without protest, peeled out the bunks, torn and stiff, and myself, thirsty and whiskered. I worked the sprawl search and rescue, leashed the dogs, unspooled rope, baked bodies, collected resin for fuel tanks, plunged drills down holes, poked at slugs with my rifle. One day, the older recruits marched me to the showers and told me to get prim. I accepted 2 medals for protecting foreign dignitaries. My director and department were shocked to hear I wanted to retire to a lowly auditor at the age of 24. They were puzzled by my decision, but after a room full of handshakes, after I'd surrendered my clothes for the next soldier, my leaky and clouded binoculars, and a tin of hand-rolled cigarettes, I was installed in Daejeon as the youngest superior at the office. I so assumed my position, nobody called me again. Thank you.
That was so beautiful. It's such an honor to help launch The Liberators by E.J. Ko. And I just want to start off by congratulating you on the release of the book. we are here in New York, and I'm going to a lot of bookstores, as one does in New York, and I see it everywhere. And so very, very happy for that. So I read the book. I absolutely loved it. But before we talk about why I love the book, could you, for the audience, maybe tell us what this book is about?
Sure. So it's interesting. You don't have to have read my memoir, but reading the memoir might give some perspective to the main characters that we start with. And so my mother's parents, June and Lee, in the memoir, they sort of stayed with me long after, and they, in some ways, became the shadow of Johan and Johan's relationship to his wife and his daughter. And from there, I really wanted to highlight the 1980s in Daejeon, where my parents lived at the time. And so we really see the time of of martial law, of the military dictatorship. We follow this family to California in the U.S., and we also get a glimpse of sort of the impact of the 1988 Seoul Olympics and sort of the complexity of that issue, not only in South Korea, but also in the diaspora, in the Korean diaspora, and the way it was really divisive. And then we go into sort of some of the flashbacks of the characters and their history with the Japanese repatriation process, and some of the history that might not be so easy to find, actually, and was a really important and vital to address some of those historical moments. And of course, we follow this family through the generations, through their children, and their ongoing life here, and the impact of issues between North and South, and as well as, I want to say, more recent tragedies like the Sewol ferry accident.
Yes. So the novel is, you can kind of see it as part of the ongoing expansion of the E.J. Ko extended universe. That's a really interesting point to come upon, the fact that so much of this novel actually comes from your own life and your personal history, as well as the history of America and Korea. What gave you the idea to write The Liberators as a novel? What was the impetus behind? You could have written another memoir or maybe another nonfiction book, a historical memoir, but you decided to use the form of fiction. And was it perhaps because there are certain forms of truth that, fiction is more, perhaps more, makes more accessible? As a poet, I'm sure you would understand what that means. What was the impetus behind The Liberators as, a novel?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. As usual, I often go to Anton's events. I'm sort of in the background and have been in an event with Anton. And so Anton always asks the most wonderful, brilliant questions. And I think I was thinking of the novel while I was working on a Korean American television show and another Korean television show. So I was doing some screenplays, and I was finishing up the memoir at the time, and in the middle of something that would later become my dissertation. So it's a really interesting space I was in, because it seemed like I'm working on different projects, but it felt like one big project, because I'm researching sort of the same things: personal history, but also Korean history, Japanese history. I'm looking at a lot of records and archives, a lot of photographs, a lot of interviewing. But I came across this wonderful writer and researcher named Elizabeth Rosner, who has this book, Survivor Cafe. And she does wonderful research, not only on her Jewish legacy, but she sort of goes over the mass trauma that's happened all over the world, and she bridges them. She tries to look at them in different ways and say, these are the ways in which we're deeply tied and connected with one another. And something she says that stayed with me was that this tenacious human lineage we have is a braid. It's a braid of destruction and reparation. And those things we assume are to be very opposite, but it was so fascinating to see them so tightly wound together. And she says, if we are representing like the record of human history, the collected memory, we have to think about perspectives. We can't just give the perspective of the prisoner or the guard. You want the perspectives of the prisoner and the guard. You want the memories of the perpetrators and the collaborators. You want the memory of those who are buried in mass graves and those who have to dig them. And so this sort of wanting to see and walk toward what that human history looks like, I think lended itself to the novel and its many perspectives. I mean, even not only in the novel, we have a prisoner and we have a guard. We also have a coroner. We also have a dog. We have a sort of airline attendant. We have so many characters and perspectives in order to show, well, what is the truth here?
Yeah, that's so amazing. I had a professor named Hyun Jung. She's a translator for Kyung Suk Shin's The Girl Who Wrote Loneliness. And there's something that she said to me that resonates to this day, where she said, fiction is the art of the perspective, and how a story completely changes depending on which perspective you tell it. And as you were talking about, I was thinking about like that chapter with the dog and also the chapter with the flight attendants. Really interesting that she has a Japanese name, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also kind of like an interesting twist on what is going on in that story, because also I'm sorry, I'm rambling now, but also she has some kind of face blindness where she can only recognize someone if they're on a screen on a device, but she doesn't in real life. And that's kind of like a metaphor for like historical blindness. And I thought that was really, really, anyway, there's so many brilliant things about this book that I really want to get into, but do not have time for. But there is one thing that I really want to talk about when it comes to this book. And it really kind of like when you were reading from your 3 separate books, it really brought into focus is the fact that the language is so poetic. And it doesn't matter like what genre you're writing in, like the poetic resonance is so profound in all of your writing. This book, The Liberators, its style is very unusual. I really love its exquisite attention to detail and how at the same time it doesn't over-explain things. And the characters, of course, as you said, take turns telling the story, and each of them are so real in how they remember the details of their lives. And I just wanted to ask you, how did you come up with this style? Because this is not written like a conventional historical novel where there's a grand epic, backdrop, and then everyone has a kind of like godlike perspective of what is going on in history. And then you have these characters and then you watch the characters go through the history. Like it doesn't play like that. How did you decide to write the book in the way that it is written?
That is also another really great question. And I feel like you see everything as a reader and as a writer and translator yourself. You sort of are able to read and mine the book in these really interesting conversations we can have. And so thank you. I think I'm really enjoying this moment with you. So in terms of the writing style, it's interesting because my first language in a way was poetry. And if I were to take one lesson from poetry and I couldn't take any other lessons with me, it would be this one single lesson that a teacher of mine, the teacher that I read about, Susan Davis, in the memoir just now, who taught me. And this one lesson, I took it through to write my memoir and my novel. It's almost like the single thing I continue to drive, which is, I had written those 40 poems initially about my mother and brought them to her. And she said, you really know how to start a poem and you can always fill out a poem. But with you have trouble with the end of the poem, which is called the turn. It's the penultimate line or it's the last line. But it's a point in the poem in which you have to access magnanimity. You have to access some sort of way to imagine how, like something beyond your own self, something beyond what you're capable of saying in that moment. Otherwise, it's not a poem. This is what she's taught me. It's a journal or it's a diary entry, but this is what makes a poem a poem. And so in the memoir, a lot of my work is looking for the turn, especially with the relationships, the turn with the relationship with me and my mother, the relationship to the past. But in the novel, I really take this to another degree because I really wanted to find the turn in the imagery, find the turn at times in a sentence, a really unexpected turn in a sentence, in a passage, in a chapter. What is the turn for each of the characters, like the mother-in-law Huran in that case? What is her turn, even if it's on, the last moments of her life? Is that turn too late for her? And so I think a lot of I maintained a lot of the work that I do with poetry. And I also, this is more of an aside because I just want to continue saying how wonderful you are, is that I read a lot of your interviews. I'm really familiar with sort of the language you use, and I was really moved because I wasn't seeing this too much at the time, at least another prolific artist saying this really publicly, but about how, I think the interviewer asked you if there's something that can't be felt universally, that there's this sort of essential Koreanness, and that it keeps you from one thing or another, that there's this border. And you said in this really beautiful, wonderful response, which I wish was, recorded and on the screen for everyone, you just broke that border down. And you said, something along the lines, not to repeat too much, but that people aren't going to read the work because you're Korean, but it's because you're Korean and you understand national tragedy and national, pain and grief, that you can read and appreciate anything, and that anyone who understands that can read and appreciate your work. And so that was, I've got to say, that was an important moment for me too, to be honest, to say, okay, this is really important, not just on this subject, but on thinking of humanity.
Oh, thank you so much. God, I don't even remember that answer. So thank you for giving it back to me. That is really amazing. I really love what you said about the turns, because I really did feel like this book was like a collection of poems. Each chapter was essentially like a long prose poem, because it was so poetically written. But it also, you made me notice the turns now. I'm going to go back and reread it again and again and again. You kind of touched upon the idea of like national tragedy. And as a translator of Korean literature, I found trauma to be especially tricky to translate. I don't want to perpetuate trauma. I don't want to traumatize the reader through conveying trauma. And I don't want to be traumatized as a translator. Like, for example, there are things that I won't translate. Like if there's a novel and, a child is being murdered, then I won't translate that book. Like that kind of thing. I have my ways of protecting myself. But the way that trauma is handled in your book and in all your work, really, there's something just so thoughtful about it and so just almost loving. And you don't sensationalize it, you don't trivialize it, but you still manage to convey the magnitude of it, like, what poetry is supposed to do. And so I was wondering what your thought process was behind writing about trauma in general.
This is another really fantastic discussion to have, and it reminds me of, I got a chance to work with different directors for different shows, or even for looking at their screenplay or whatnot. But there was this one director on a show for it was a Korean American show, and I wasn't there as a writer. I was actually there for this one as a consultant. And I was more of and this is what they term it. It's really interested. I'm a cultural consultant because I was sort of the only Korean American in the room to speak to the experiences of the characters they were writing. And I think I really hesitated, but at the same time, I thought, well, at least I need to be there. Someone needs to sort of be in the room to at least witness and see what's happening. And it was interesting because the director and I butted heads on. There's this moment in the script where it's a father and son arguing. They're in the US, and the father sort of says something like, you've made me suffer, and then yells at the son and slams the door on the son, and the son sort of screams, cries, or has a really big response. And the director, and I sort of disagreed because I think for the director, this was a representation of a form of Korean anger, which for some reason I don't like to talk about, makes me angry, even though I'm sort of trying to say that that's not a thing necessarily to be pushing down as if it's a monolith of some sort of anyway, it was just interesting because for the director, it was the slamming of the door, it was the yelling, it was the words, you made me suffer. But for me, something that felt truer to the experience of the specific traumas of this family was, the silence after slamming the door. We need to stay there. We need to stay in the space. It's the moment of the father walking away and realizing what you have to do to yourself to abandon your own son. It's not the slamming of the door. It's not the son, begging to be asked back. It's the son finding a way to love someone who left you. This is where we want to go. Those are the spaces, the white spaces, the silences. And I think when I'm representing a family or even something more of a historical tragedy and something throughout generations, I do look for that. I'm not necessarily looking and thinking that all the slammed doors in this world equal to all the broken families. I don't think that's true. I think if that were true, there'd be a lot more slammed doors and a lot less broken families. But you also touch upon, both of us being translators, and translation just in general has informed me quite a bit, not only with perspectives, but thinking of intergenerational trauma, because I think in poetry, I was learning to have a voice in a way, learning to say, this is how I'm communicating, this is how I like to communicate. But in translation was when I started saying, oh, these are the questions I have. This is what I want to research and find out. This is what I don't know, and this is what I need to know. And they lead to more questions. I think translation was the place in which I felt like, oh, I'm translating one language to another. Wait, these languages belong to nations, and those nations have relationships. They have a history. So these languages have a relationship. And for some reason, I am in many ways an outsider to all of this happening. And those brought me such new perspectives that I thought, okay, I really want to, this is what I want to write about.
Oh my God. So thank you for creating a very good segue into the next question. But because when I was reading this book, I was just so fascinated by, because as a Korean translator translating from Korean into English, especially American English is what I translate into. It's so fraught with so many complicated issues and implications, betrayals, and the need to keep silent on some things and the need to not to express other things and to expose other things. And also the very, very delicate task of, is it okay to do this here? Like constantly asking oneself. because reading this book, it kind of like made me think of all the times where I had to think about those questions, because this book is extremely political, and it deals with very, very sensitive issues, especially in its handling of historical Korea-US relations in a way that is still very rare in mainstream literature. So Korea is a country under an imposed two-state solution with a long-standing ceasefire agreement, with orthodoxy continuing to demonize North Korea as the enemy, quote unquote. But as a Korean citizen and reader of English literature, your challenge of this orthodoxy was very moving to me, very moving to read, like to tears almost. And it joins books in Korea, like I Went to See My Father by Kyung-suk Shin and We Do Not Part by Han Kang, that are finally beginning to grapple with taboo Korean War themes like in the mainstream. So what was your thinking behind writing about the themes of the Korean War, the reunification and war atrocities committed by our military allies? All of these topics are so fraught and that could invite so much criticism and so much bad will. How did you handle those anxieties, if you had any? How did you decide to write about all of this?
That's very true. And I share those feelings with you. And I feel, a bridge between us and our experiences, not just as translators, but in the literature that we really love and hold close to our hearts. But it's interesting. I was doing, and I feel like you don't need to be a part of a program to do this. But for me, this was a huge lesson. If I could take a lesson from my doctorate work, was just to read immense bodies of work, not to be afraid to say, hey, I'm going to just go ahead and read 10 books on this subject or this matter, and just see how I feel at the end of it. See what kind of questions I ask. And so I was doing another form of that. I was reading, sort of looking for 100 works of literature, but also across, poetry, plays, nonfiction, fiction, graphic novels, anything by a work from the Korean diaspora. And I wanted to read all of them. And I sort of did that side by side with looking up Korean and Korean American history, at the same time looking at Korean film. And so I think at the end of all that, what I learned was that I want to not just speak to the work that's out there. I want to contribute to it, because it gave me such a survey of not just all the work and incredible works of art that had to happen, including yours, in order for me to say the things I'm going to say in this novel that I couldn't have said with the conversation being pushed to where it is. And I see that, by the way, in many conversations with authors and, producers, of course, and anyone saying we're not really ready for this. But there's this sort of forward momentum I felt in addressing these more taboo topics in the Korean War, also the issues between assumptions between the North-South and U.S. relations, and the issues with the Japanese repatriation process and more of the specifics of that. But knowing that, I felt like I want to contribute and know where I am. If I were to slot my book somewhere and say, this is one step further in that conversation. This is one step. And even though I'm really excited about this book, I'm not lost on the fact that it's one book. And my hope is that this book is more like a stepping stone for future authors or books that are coming out like yours, to use that stepping stone to say further things, to push the conversation further in ways that we have yet to go. And I think the perspective in the Liberators always, moves me, because I was really thinking of, in some ways, in any community, especially for my family being Korean immigrants and Korean Americans and being in this really tight-knit Korean Catholic community in California, it's almost like you expect the word community to be such a safe haven, but you forget that, community has its edges. It has its own formations. And sometimes the place you go to when you're here alone in a small apartment in California with your community, you think you're in a safe space, quote unquote. But sometimes that safe space can become the most dangerous place for you. And it was important to in any community or safe space to constantly acknowledge that. And I think there is a lot of considered safe spaces that aren't safe if you are sort of outsider to sort of the dominant narrative of the Korean community. And you see a lot of that in the diaspora and the divisiveness that happens, and also the outsiderness of what is a Korean American and what can you say about the things that happened in mainland South Korea. But you also see that just even my family being from Jeju Island, this sort of saying, oh, that is a very different history. You have a very different sense of Korean history. And, my grandmother's parents, growing up in Japan. And so that is also very different split. And so I didn't want the perception of Korean history and really the quote unquote outsiders of Korean history to not be a part of it. I think it's not a monolith. The experience and perspectives of everyone is so vital.
Yeah, that was what was so moving for me, because I felt like the way that you handled those themes, especially with Jeju, I felt like only a Korean American writer can really write this way. And I'm just so glad that you did, that you 총대를 매다, like you took it upon yourself. You put the rifle on your shoulder and said, okay, I'm going to do this part, because this is the part where only a Korean American writer who has, those perspectives can really can create that contribution. This is an extremely generous, extremely brave work. And I'm so grateful for you for embarking on it. As a translator, I have to ask you about form. Just one more time. I love novels that are written by poets. It's like one of my favorite genres. Poetry written by novelists, not so much, but I love novels written by poets. Like Ocean Vuong has that beautiful novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Margaret Atwood's poets turned novelist, Michael Ondaatje. And Korea has a lot of that. Han Kang, who used to be a poet, debuted as a poet and became a novelist. And so I feel like you are very much like working in this Korean tradition of not caring about what genre you came from, but writing about what you want to write about. This is still very unusual in American letters, I feel. It happens, but it's still considered pretty rare. So aside from your obvious Korean excellence, what made you write in different genres the way that you do? And more importantly, for me personally, what is your secret to your success in all these different forms? What are your secrets as a writer, basically?
That's very generous. Thank you. I want to ask you the same question. Maybe we can come around to that, because I feel like you're constantly producing new work, and you're also moving into different genres. So I really admire that, also with very difficult subjects. So I'm excited for your book, and I have it, and I'm going to read it soon. But with moving into across different genres of work, I think in the beginning, I thought a lot of it as separate, almost like entering different rooms. And then maybe more recently, I've realized that a lot of those boundaries are kind of self-imposed, and that I can take those boundaries down. And that actually, when I was writing this novel, and maybe this is, if I were to have a secret, maybe the secret is I never read more poetry in my life than when I was writing fiction. When I was writing and working on fiction, if I really wanted to get to understand not just the turn, but looking for the essential truths and the essential images and ways to to create those silences and those moments and pauses, knowing where to begin, knowing where to end. That really came from reading so much poetry alongside the work I was doing for the Liberators. And the memoir is the exact opposite. I think the memoir, while I was writing it and I was doing some translation with it, a lot of what I was reading was fiction. It was short stories. It was fiction. It was sometimes really, really long fiction or really flash fiction, but I was focusing on reading fiction to help me really pull out those stories from, my grandmother's parents, from the different events of their lives, them escaping the Kanto massacre that happened in Japan after the Kanto earthquake, them moving from Japan back to Jeju Island. I think it needed not only the historical aspects, but it needed a quality of testimony. And fiction has that. Fiction gives you the important, vital function of testimony. And testimony has a very unifying aspect. It has a very liberating aspect. I think it's important to human society. And so fiction provides that. And so I really needed that for the memoir.
That's incredible. So many questions.
Yeah.
But that will
questions from the audience. So I'm gonna start with is there a plan for the Liberators to be translated into Korean? If so, in what way would you like the Korean readers to read this book? What do you want them to take away from this book?
Oh, that's such a nice question. So there is a plan for the Liberators. It was picked up in Korea by a wonderful company, and they're working on translating it now. I won't be translating it because it would take 10 years. I have someone else who's much more talented than I am is translating it. And what's so interesting is this wasn't for the translation for the Liberators. It was actually for the audiobook for the Liberators, which because there's some Korean and also Korean characters, we're talking to many Korean actors, Korean and Korean American actors, particularly in New York City. But they asked me, pronounce, spelling like Insuk's name this way is more Korean to say Insuk, or spelling, some of these other characters this name, or having them say it this way is more, Korean in the form of like mainland, South Korea, like this is what they would say in Seoul, not even mainland, maybe a little smaller than that. And I think a part of me resisted some of that. I wanted to keep some of the awkwardness. I wanted to keep the little differences. I think previously I might have, and I would have asked my colleagues, like, does this sound really Korean? Does it sound Korean enough? And now I've gone the other way, right? Where I'm just like, I just want to sound like me. I just want to sound like I am the one that's writing this. And I am coming from also a really complicated, different past and way of understanding this language. I want to keep it. I want, my hope is Koreans, and I have lots of family there, to see that, oh, this is Unji wrote this, in a way, this is and could only have been written by her. So thank you.
Another question about the sort of the form. So the novel, The Liberators, relatively short at just over 200 pages. How does the length of the book contributes to its impact? And how does the author effectively convey the depth of characters and their experiences in this very concise form?
That's also a great question. Maybe the best audience questions I've had. I mean, we're just getting started, but I dare, are these planted questions? These are fantastic. But the length of it is quite short for such a sweeping novel, and for the generations and also the geography and the time it crosses. But I did a lot of work where, the mother-in-law, Huran, there's a scene where she's going on a walk and a tree falls right on top of her head. It barely misses her. And instead of running away or screaming, she sort of just looks around and just continues walking. And in many ways, there are many examples of that, but in many ways that could have been a whole chapter, in a way to explain her interiority, in a way to explain that this is, really the aftermath of someone who's lived through war, who's lived through horrible things, and that actually it's in the environments that are completely calm, that she feels in danger, and that in this environment in which her life is in danger, she feels quite calm. She feels just worrying about getting home in time for her family. And so I do make choices like that, which lends itself to a shorter novel, I think, I want to say, but also I have a lot of spaces, a lot of ways in which the novel starts and stops to give us room to consider those moments for ourselves. I think that in that way, because of the length and because of those choices, it makes for quite a demanding novel, and it asks a lot from the reader. And I like to go halfway and to meet you halfway. And so, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, like you can't really skim this novel. You really do have to kind of take your time with it and even like pause between chapters to really take in exactly as EJ says. So it really does take longer than it may look from the outside.
A question about, I guess, your relationship to Korean literature. So you're bilingual and you can read Korean and you translate from Korean. As a writer, what is the experience like for you? Is there a difference between what you take from Korean literature versus English or American literature? And do you think you can be the writer you are without your knowledge of Korean language?
It's so interesting. And a really deep, deep question. It comes from a deep place. And I love this conversation with Korean literature. I translated a book of poetry by a Korean poet, Iwon, who's sort of the successor to another wonderful Korean poet, Kim Il-sung. And I was introduced to Iwon through Dami Che, who sort of my mentor at the time in translation and was translating Kim Il-sung. So, and then me and my colleague Marcy Calabretta Cancio Bello decided we're going to translate quite a bit of Iwon's work and make it a collected poetry book. But so that was such a wonderful experience because it brought me and Marcy and Dami and Kim Il-sung and Iwon sort of all together. And by the way, then on, Marcy and I continued to mentor other young translators who would go on to translate works introduced to us by Iwon and Kim Il-sung. And so there's this real, there is, again, with the metaphor of the bridge, this bridging of understanding and seeing one another as Korean and Korean, in this case, Korean and Korean American women writers, and seeing each other and each other's work and recognizing one in the other. It's almost like when you have two lakes together and you see the reflection of yourself in the other lake. And it's just a way to understand that, okay, we're trying to do something together. We come from very different places and backgrounds and experiences, but we also share something that's undeniable, and we all want to do this thing together. We want to bring this literature more broadly, more widely, and especially to an American audience. And that's sort of, like I was telling Anton, translation was really the place. I mean, it gave me a lot in terms of enjoying and loving the sounds of Korean, writing and translating my mother's letters, particularly in a way that sounded more Korean and less efficient, less on the nose, but more in ways that were more creative for me. But translation was the space in which I started to ask questions about the things I wanted to ask and the things I wanted to say about Koreans in the diaspora.
So this is actually a question from me because I've spoken with you a couple of times before, but I never got to ask this question and I always wanted to. So I'm going to take my chance. Can you tell us a little bit about your love letter project? Because I think that is such a lovely, lovely thing you do. So I always wanted to ask you why you decide to do it and do it in the way you are still keep doing it. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's such a that is something I would love to talk about. I started the project around 2016. I wasn't publishing, or I hadn't published at all at that point. I was working on more publishing in journals or magazines and little one-off poems and maybe a story. But I think I was in a dark place where I felt like I couldn't continue writing, and that maybe writing wasn't for me, and that I was ready to give it up, because I think staying in writing was starting to hurt more than what might be possible for me in my life without it, if I can just sort of continue my life instead of putting it on pause. And so I let go of writing for about 6 months. I just decided that maybe this isn't quite for me, and that's okay. You know, I should be able to live with that. However, during that time, I went online, I went on Twitter, and I said, I still want to write 1,000 love letters to strangers. And if anyone wants one, just, let me know. And the instructions are still on my website, but it's just, let me know a little bit about yourself, give me a physical mailing address, and I'll handwrite you a love letter. And I really said that on a whim. I mean, it's not like I knew many people at all at the time either. But I woke up in the morning and I had requests from all over the world. Not just, I even had one, across the street or in the city I'm in, but also just all, places all over that I didn't know that anyone was listening and maybe needed me to listen. And so I started writing love letters and realizing, oh, it's not about writing. It's not about quitting or doing writing. And I had made that the thing, but writing's not the thing. It's the thing that gets you to the real thing, which is human connection. And that's the thing I always wanted. That's the thing I longed for. And once I understood that it's human connection, I returned to writing as a very different person, as a very different human being, never forgetting that this holds another purpose, that it's not the end. It's sort of getting you to a beginning. And so I have, today I've written just over 600 love letters, and I'm almost at 1,000 love letters, but I'm not there yet. So if people want a love letter, it's very easy to get one, and I always get to them. Yeah.
So, and this is purely between you and the receiver?
Yes.
And you don't have any, I'm assuming that you don't have any intention to publish them or anything, but
No.
have you ever received a response from the person who received the letter?
That's a good question. I don't put my sort of response, or I don't put a sort of return address. I sort of allow it to be one way, a way to listen and say I'm listening, to share that I love you. You're another human being across the world, and you're not an alien to me. You're human. I'm human, and I can see you. And maybe the times that really people responded was if I'd go to a reading or I would have an event, someone might say, I was one of your love letters. And I think that's always followed by, what's your name? And usually just from hearing the name, I can remember the details of the letter. And, we embrace, and sometimes I'm given gifts or little letters. I was visiting Oregon State University not too long ago for a lecture. And one of the MFA students wrote me a letter saying, thank you for everything you've done. And I couldn't give this to you unless we're in person. And those moments really make everything worth it, I think. I think that's what the point is. That is what we want to do.
Well, thanks for doing it. So how about we go to Anton for the last question?
Hey, it's a very, very easy, obvious question. But what are you working on next? What can we expect in the near and far future from from the EJ extended universe?
Yeah, this extended universe goes on, and I am working on something. I'm not quite sure what the shape is the thing that's most curious right now. I'm not sure. It's definitely hybrid and is going to do much of what I've been doing before, but again, taking on some quite contentious issues. And really, I'm going to also quote your work. So I might be reaching out to you not too long in the future, where I'll say, does this sound like you? But I'm enjoying working on that. I think I'm constantly working on a few projects at a time, and it's only once every 5-6 years or so that I'm sort of this quote unquote author. I'm an author for a month or two, but the rest of the time I'm just waking up and being a bit of a slob and being really lazy, but also writing. And that's where I get a lot of my joy. And so I'm just writing, every day, or days I can, days that I feel healthy. If I don't feel quite right, I won't write. And that's just how I see it happening. Yeah.
That's so amazing. Thank you so much, EJ.
Thank you, Anton. This was so wonderful. I appreciate you. I appreciate you taking the time and all the effort and energy it takes to read a book, to read a demanding book, to have these questions and to really dive in while working on your own book. And so thank you. Thank you, Jay, for having me and for, being really the first person to say, let's do this event right now. As I'm finishing my copy edits, you're saying, we're going to do this. I go, okay, give me some time, but okay, we'll do this. So thank you.
And thank you, EJ and Anton, for this wonderful, lovely conversation. I'd like to also thank our team behind the scene, Peter, Bradley, and Rachel. And we wish you, EJ and Anton, both of you, the best of luck. The Liberators are sold wherever books are sold. So happy reading. And thanks for joining us tonight.
Mm-hmm.